Hello, thank you for joining us. Welcome from me, Michael Scott, in Oxford, in the UK, and from my joint convener, Sanford J. Ungar in Washington, DC, to this jointly promoted event between the Future of the Humanities Project and the Free Speech Project. The latter is sponsored by Georgetown University and the former by Georgetown's Humanities Initiative in association with Campion Hall, Oxford, and the Las Casas Institute for Social Justice at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. Together, the two projects consider issues concerning human dignity, rights, cultures, histories, traditions, and freedoms in a wide spectrum of educational activity, policy, expression, and aspiration. In a moment, I'll hand over to Sandy, who is the director of the Free Speech Project. He will introduce today's distinguished guests and moderate the ensuing discussion before I return to chair the question and answer session. From the start, you can type in questions to the panel by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please use the Q&A button and not the chat button. These questions will come to me during the session, and I will try and put them to the panel to consider later on. We urge you to ask questions as and when they occur to you so that we don't get a bottleneck at the end. I'm looking forward greatly to this panel discussion. Now, over to you, Sandy.
Thank you very much, Mike. And it is a wonderful thing to be joining together for our 42nd consecutive month of virtual programs of this sort, starting in the depths of the pandemic. This is one of our favorite subjects. It affects freedom of expression, popular culture, artistic values and thoughts, talents, attitudes, critiques, what have you. And we're very happy to be discussing it with a very interesting group of people. We have two actual artists with us today, Estelle Thompson and Dennis DeCaires. They work in Barbados and in the UK. They happen both to be in Barbados today, and who can blame them? They have some, I think, very interesting thoughts. They've been teachers and commentators. They've had important commissions to incorporate art in the environment of public buildings, and a great deal of experience to draw upon. We also have Mary Beth Willard, a professor of philosophy at Weber State University in Ogden, Utah, and specialist in this area of this question of popular culture. This is not a new question. It's a very old question. It's one that people have been talking about a long time. And notably, Mary Beth is the author of a book called Why It's Okay to Enjoy the Work of Immoral Artists. So people can breathe a sigh of relief. They're not alone. Also, Constance Grady, a senior correspondent on the culture team for Vox Media, where she has covered books publishing gender, celebrity analysis, and theater, and written some very provocative. She actually runs the book club for Vox Media and chooses the books, runs the discussions, so has had a lot of practice with questions like this. I'd like to start with Mary Beth Willard, excuse me, who's been on this subject for a long time, and might give us an overview. I mean, what is the problem that's bothering all of us here? How would you characterize it? Maybe not everyone's bothered by it, but I certainly am.
I think you're not alone, and I think everyone's fair enough if we allow a little room for generalization. So I think the problem is this. A lot of us really love art, and I'm using the term really broadly to include, everything from fine art to comedy, right? So think of your favorite celebrity, I think might be a good way to do this. We love art, we love what they do, we follow them, and then we discover that they're a deeply horrible person morally, that maybe they've assaulted somebody, maybe they've done something really bad. And then we try to figure out what we ought to do. And when I wrote the book, the conversation tended to bounce between two poles. On the one hand, let's just separate the art from the artist, pretend we never saw it, and carry on like nothing happened. And on the other hand, cancel them, right? Get rid of it, curate your aesthetic life so that the people you like are also good people. And my book is essentially a way to kind of chart the middle ground and offer guidance to people who are kind of confused about some of these issues or don't know what to do when an artist they love turns out to be a drastically horrible human being.
What would be one piece of salient guidance that you would give to get us started?
To get us started, I would say think about what you would actually accomplish when you have the urge to cancel somebody or censor somebody, right? Because sometimes I think that the reaction is one of expression. I don't like this. I don't have a way to punish them. I'm going to show it. But if you think about what you would actually accomplish, you might find that it might not actually be effective and you might not have the result that you want. But I guess actually, in summary, I would say there's no easy answers, which is the title of my first chapter. It's like, sorry, I don't have a bad explanation, but it depends is a really boring answer to questions. So
No,
I'm fine to
I
amp it
must
up if
say
we need to.
that's what Mike Scott and I specialize in topics where there is no easy answer,
Convenient.
and yeah, and so we're used to that. Estelle and Dennis, when you are doing your work, when you're having a productive day, and I know, of course, that for artists like everyone else, not every day is productive, but do you worry at all about what interpretation people might put on your work, what nasty thought they might find somehow embedded in your work and have to push aside, or do you think about whether you're pleasing your audience or not, Estelle? Maybe you could answer that first.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the whole, kind of side kind of conversation. I was interested with Mary Beth there that it suddenly occurred to me, that it's quite a contemporary issue in a sense, because an artist, certainly within fine art, but maybe within literature too long ago, you would have not known what the artist was like. You would have had no information necessarily on them as a moral or social being. So it's a very contemporary kind of concern that we've got. I'm someone who actually, as an artist, I'm very interested in artists' biographies. And so I've loved reading about which groups particularly got interested in the surrealist groups and those that, their life together, how they were breaking forth. But at the same time, for me, I got concerned about the women involved were seemingly in a very progressive group of male artists, and there was something interesting that was happening for them socially. But at the same time, retrospectively, we might see that as something highly problematic, that they were exploited in some way. I only mention this because I equally have an interest in artists, visual artists who write books, fiction in the main, but Picasso wrote a play. There's many, many examples. And it did occur to me, is there something different, because it's a narrative form, is there something different that I connect between them as an artist and their written expression than their visual expression? I perhaps have led you away a little bit, Sandy, there from
that's quite all right.
What you were hoping I might have to say. From my own perspective, I don't concern myself with an audience. When I was young, I was making very politically motivated work. I was making work that connected to rape and gender issues. And I moved away from that. I won't go into here why I did. It's a very long kind of story, but at the same time, my work now, I feel is perhaps political, but nobody else would interpret it as political because the subjects within it are not single issue politics, nor are they necessarily meant to drive how you receive and engage with the work. So, yeah, in short, the answer to my audience is no, but then equally, I'm not convinced that I've done anything so terribly morally difficult or awful that might concern anybody else.
Right. I'm going on mute from time to time because there seems to be a vacuum cleaner in the hallway just outside of my office here in Washington at Georgetown University. So I just soon spare our listeners and viewers and all of you the sound of the vacuum cleaner. The bells are okay, but the vacuum cleaner, no. Dennis, how would you amend or elaborate on what Estelle has just said?
Well, the first thing I want to say is I'm very disappointed with Mary Beth because I came for some answers today because this is a problem of art and artists that I've been thinking about ever since I was a student 400 years ago. And so I really wanted some clarity on this. And I think it's a really interesting problem to try and unpick, which is what we're doing. But in terms of being an artist, I never ever think about what an audience, how an audience will respond until after the work is made and it's out there. And it never ever occurs to me that someone might think about this. But listening to Estelle, the one thing that we're looking at art and artists, and first of all, I think one assumption that it's always problematic. So it's when an artist has done something highly immoral. And I think it's interesting to look at the flip side of that when you have a highly moral artist making bad work. And I think that's quite an interesting flipping it. And the other thing that I was thinking about a couple of days before, I would get all my answers today, that as an artist in the studio, if you produce work and then it leaves the studio and it's for sale, are we responsible for the people who buy it, who take it away? So what happens if a terrible arms dealer comes along and wants to buy work? And I thought that was an interesting, especially in terms of, sorry, moving on to another subject here, but the way that the context of art prior to the 20th century has been removed from how we normally see it. And the importance of the market now and how that relates to what we produce. I think separating the art from the artists becomes increasingly complicated when you include the audience who will now receive it. So just start off. I got more to say, but I don't want to.
Right, I can imagine you could. The example you give is an intriguing one. I think you said if an arms dealer were looking to purchase some of your work, did I understand that correctly?
Yes.
You could slip in a subversive message in the work that he or she is buying, I suppose.
I wouldn't do that, but because he or she may sell it on to a racist or to a misogynist. I mean, the list it becomes to an atheist, to a believer. I haven't got the answer for this, but I know it's not that. I can't start doing a means test on who's going to acquire work and where it will go from the studio. But I'm aware of it, but it's problematic. But there's more I want to say about it, but I want to hear Constance and others too.
Right. Constance, you're coming to us. Don't forget to unmute yourself. You're coming to us from New York today, which often has a different perspective from everywhere else on some of these questions, I think. But I wonder if I could persuade you to tell us in brief form the story that about what I read last night by you about the movie Edward Scissorhands and your reaction to it as I think you were a teenager when you first saw it, and I thought it was a particularly compelling story that I would ask you to repeat here.
Oh, sure, absolutely. And thank you so much for having me. Edward Scissorhands was one of those Tim Burton, Johnny Depp movies from the early 90s. It's a very, very charming, aesthetically stylized movie where Johnny Depp plays Edward Scissorhands, the boy who has scissors instead of hands, so he can't be close to anyone without hurting them, even though he is very emotionally vulnerable and longs for connection. I think Johnny Depp has said in interviews that he played Edward Scissorhands like a beloved dog that he once had. There's a lot of like puppy dog eyes. Very compelling, utter catnip for like bookish teenage girls. I was madly in love with this movie as a teenager. And even as I started to grow out of it a little bit, I still had a lot of nostalgic fondness for it. And then in the 2010s, Johnny Depp was accused of domestic violence by his ex-wife Amber Heard. A lot of that's been a case that's been relitigated a lot on social media, but from my perspective, a lot of Amber Heard's evidence was pretty striking and compelling. So, sort of the question I was faced with was every time I thought about this movie and how much I loved it as a teenager now, I also had this association with pictures of this woman's bruised face and the stories that she had told about what this man who is so sweetly performing emotional vulnerability, these terrible things that he had allegedly done to her. And it was really hard for me to try to square those two things. So I eventually started trying to talk to a bunch of literary critics about different ways you can do this because, as we've said, this is a problem that's been around for a very, very long time. And there are actually a lot of schools of thought that have been carefully worked out about different ways of approaching the problem of separating the artist from the artist, whether it's a worthwhile thing, whether it's productive, what you can do there. So at the time that I was reporting on this story, there was a kind of default assumption, I think, that it was a little childish to let your ideas of the artist inform your reaction to the art. And I sort of felt like it's never helpful to me when I'm approaching a work of art in my work as a critic to try to tamp down any of my responses. I think that it becomes much more interesting and provocative to me to pay attention to all of my emotional reactions and work with them in tandem. So I have deep fondness and childhood love for Edward Scissorhands, and I also have this reaction, this sort of instinctive reaction of sadness and disgust when I see Johnny Depp now. And I think that for me, what's been most productive has been to find ways to hold both of those emotions in my mind at the same time when I consider the movie and think about how it can help me think through those problems together.
Mary Beth, I saw you shaking your head in different directions
Yeah,
when
well, it was no, you those people are wrong. You ought to bring what you think about the artist. So it was shaking my head no in agreement with Constance. For
I
me, the
see.
story is actually Bill Cosby. So similar kind of situation, beloved childhood icon. I think I watched every episode of The Cosby Show in syndication as a kid. When I wrote about it for a magazine article, I recounted the little story I wanted to tell about one of the episodes pretty much from memory, right? So it was very, very much a part of my childhood. And then all of the allegations, accusations, and subsequent convictions came out. And for me, it has completely destroyed Cosby's work. Uh, and I think that's actually a completely fine reaction, right? So in my in the way I think about this, I distinguish pretty carefully between do you have to give up the artist? Like, do you have an ethical obligation to dislike Edward Scissorhands or The Cosby Show? And ought you to, is it okay if you bring in what you know about the artist and that affects your evaluation of the art? And I think they're different questions. I would say if it didn't bother you, Constance, if you're like, look, Johnny Depp's a jerk, but I still have such fond feelings with the little Scissorhands and the quirky, bookish Winona Ryder thing going on, I would say, yeah, that's fine. You're not gonna like make him go to jail or harm him at this point or dissuade him from being a horrible person. Yeah, enjoy your VHS copy of the movie, but you're not. There's no ethical obligation to feel a certain way, right? The question, I think, so they're different questions. One is how does it affect it, and I think a lot of times it just ruins the art, and I don't think you're wrong to think that. For me, Cosby's whole shtick was sort of America's dad, right? A guy who knew right from wrong. And that also includes not drugging people in your dressing room after you're filming episodes, right? And that's a fairly obvious bad moral thing to do and very much against the spirit of his artwork. And for me, it was kind of like, okay, now you've just been a giant hypocrite. And that was sufficient for me to ruin the artwork. And I don't feel a need to like get over it. So my head shake was, yeah, I completely agree where you're coming from. But if somebody's all right with it, if they're like, look, I really love the Noah and the Ark sketch and I can do the voices with it, and I have fond memories of listening to it with my parents, so I still like, pulling out the old vinyl album of it. I don't think they have an ethical obligation to give it up. So, philosopher over here making distinctions, what are you going to do?
Um,
Yeah, if I could jump in a little bit, I
yes,
think
Sure.
please.
Claire Dieter has written really beautifully about this in her book Monsters, which we were
Hmm.
discussing a bit before we went on. And she says, I think, something like, it's so unfair, this feeling that because this man did something bad, I have to give up this artwork that I love. And I think that's something that a lot of
Yeah.
people feel. And part of why I think it's quite reasonable to say it's not going to change anything if I stop loving this work of art, so I'm going to keep doing it. It's not fair that because of their wrongdoings, I have to lose something that's meaningful to me.
Dennis and Estelle, as you probably know, we have our free speech project has a website in which we track incidents where free expression has been challenged in the United States. Now, over the past 7 years, we have 1,000 examples documented now, which is mind-boggling, and we're way behind trying to catch up. So some of those are directly on point here. We have, as I recall, a situation where there was an art exhibition, I believe it was up in Maine, and it was at a university, and it turned out that one of the artists, one of the painters, um, had been convicted of a sex crime. I don't remember exactly what it was, and uh, his there was a great argument, and I may be conflating two incidents actually. There was also one at an independent school near Boston, which was very similar. And this person's art was removed from the exhibition. I mean, there was a very explicit discussion. Nobody consulted philosophers about this. They said, we don't want our children seeing the work by this derelict person, this evil person who committed a terrible crime, and it was taken away. Um, how do you, as artists yourselves, react to something like that? Do you ever have a kind of lurking, distant, far in the background fear that somebody might see something in one of your works and say, "Well, aha, this is just what we don't want to encourage," and we're going to. I mean, in one of these
I
cases,
mean,
something was actually hung over a painting or a sculpture.
there are two things here, Sandy. There's the work of the expression of the artist in terms of the subject and the consideration of what is being expressed, which is one thing. There are these examples where we're talking about actors who are obviously embodying a character, and they have an art form in doing that, but they're not expressing necessarily, what Edward Scissorhands was, all about. That's the author of the and the director of the film. But within an artwork, there may well be an artist who is in their own lived morality, someone we object to, but the work itself may address those things, or it may not address those things. So there are conflicting things for me here, even in the conversation, that essentially, I suppose I would probably come from the position of feeling that in society we have, hopefully in democratic societies, we have ways in which people are prosecuted, and that they are their crimes are paid for in whatever sense, both legally and also societally, but I feel I would find it very, very difficult to make my judgment, individual judgment about a person's morality hold strong relative to the work that they make. Does that make sense? I mean, I'm expressing it very badly, but I had a student, actually, a Japanese student who had decided that a very famous artist, or a relatively famous contemporary artist that she knew, she felt he had exploited female students. And she wrote to the author of a book that included his work in order to make sure that the author was aware that this person was someone that was morally reprehensible. And, I was supportive of her in that. She then actually made that into her artwork. So she wanted to use the platform of her art to address another artist's morality. So there are many layers and ways of engaging in these conversations. But for instance, Picasso is, now much, Faith Ringgold, who just died, obviously there's the current conversation about the fact that her stab at Picasso in the sort of work that both looked at Damoiselle d'Avignon, which is, much questioned about how that is questionable in terms of the depiction of women and also the use of African lineage. But we also have, on the other hand, Guernica, Picasso's Guernica, which is obviously much heralded as a moment of real political kind of clarity to denigrate war and to. So, again, at what point do we look at artists, the breadth of an artist's both lived morality and expression within their art? It can often, really span quite a wide area. It's not singular. There can be many things that they're relaying and relating to.
I have a somewhat related question. I think the two of you are especially qualified to answer. Are there different concerns working in Barbados and in London, for example? Do you feel a set of constraints in one place or worries in one place that you don't feel in the other? Dennis, I wonder if you would.
Well, I wanted to say, and to address your question and to reference what Constance was saying about a famous actor, to separate artist and artiste, because I think in the 20th century, we have become so familiar with artistes and their private lives and stardom that it becomes almost inseparable between what that actor is doing and what film they're acting in, the separation between the person and the actor. And the answer, you asked a question about artworks being censored or cancelled. And I am very reluctant for that to happen. But having said that, I'm very, very aware of the direct pain that can be caused to people who are offended by something. And I think that's a difficult act to balance. But one aspect of this, which is why I'm not for censoring or excluding anything, providing it's not intentionally offensive. I'm against anything that is deliberately produced to offend another group of people. Is that I think if things are allowed to happen, you can give the viewer or the reader or the listener agency which they didn't have before. So coming to terms with Edward Scissorhands or Picasso's portrait, you can give the viewer agency if they're able to work out what it is and what it isn't that they want to respond to. In terms, so that would relate to sensitivities in Barbados, for example, where images of colonialism, for example, in Barbados, there is what was once called Trafalgar Square, which is now called Hero Square. There was a small statue of Lord Nelson, which after many, many decades of debate has finally been removed and is now in the museum. I was in a minority, very small minority, that felt it shouldn't be moved. But I'm in a tiny minority, and I perfectly understand why the majority would want to have it moved. My feeling was that what you should try and do is put up a new statue alongside it to recognize your own heroes. So the difference between, I think, what happens in the Caribbean and what happens in Europe or North America are sensitivities, local cultural sensibilities that I don't think the West is fully attuned to. So I don't think the West is fully attuned to African sensibilities or to sensibilities in the Caribbean relating to gender issues or to religion. So this is a very complex hornet's nest, I think, that you've prodded, Sandy.
And sometimes so complex that we get ourselves tied in knots.
Yeah.
Trying to figure out how best to handle it. Constance and Mary Beth, I want to mention quickly a story I came across the other day. In Alaska, in Anchorage, there's about to be an exhibition of prison art, sponsored by the local chapter of the American Civil Liberties Union. And they feel that they are doing something all about social justice. And some members of the community in Alaska, and it's interesting. Sometimes they're far from anybody else's influence, even in the digital era. Some members of the community have a hostile reaction to this. Why should we be implicitly honoring the work of people who have presumably committed a crime serious enough to have been convicted and sentenced to prison? I don't know. I think it's still in the early stages of dispute. There's been one exhibition, but there's another one coming. I wonder how you would each react to that.
So I think it's really fascinating, actually. And to be clear, I only know about this what I've been able to read in a couple of newspaper articles. So, take what I'm thinking with a grain of salt. But I think it's an interesting case of balancing a couple of things, right? I think it shows, for one, that there's no general rule, but because here we have cases where people have done very bad things and they're making art and it's being exhibited. And sometimes this is crimes that are more serious than often the ones that show up in celebrity discussions or things like that. But there's also a countervailing consideration, right, which is that prisoners are often dehumanized and seen as lesser, and artistic expression can be rehabilitative. It can show the community, I guess the hope of the human spirit, or what people can be creative, can create, and what people are capable of. And these are really hard considerations to balance, right? Because on the one hand, if you imagine the victims in the community, right, saying like, we sent this guy to prison for something he did that was horrible, and now his artwork is hanging on the wall and you can buy it for $400. That seems disquieting, right? On the other hand, allowing people to make amends is allegedly part of the point of incarceration, and that seems like something potentially very valuable. So I'm interested to see where the conversation goes. I think it's really hard, and I think and this I think is actually my general answer, to the extent that I have one, is to keep talking about these kinds of things, right? Because it's one thing to look at an artwork and say, I'm just not going to think about what the artist did. I think it's much more interesting to say, well, they did something. Does this affect how I feel? How does that affect the community of fans? How does it affect the other people to whom I might express my artistic preferences? Uh, you know, so yeah, I mean, but the case itself is really fascinating. I think I'm inclined personally to say they should be making art. How about how to handle the exhibition might be with sensitivity, I think might be the really guiding question here. What do you think, Constance? I'm really curious.
Yeah, it is such an interesting case, and you can absolutely see both sides of it. One thing that it brings up for me that's compelling is the difference between talking about art from people who are currently serving a prison sentence, and art from people who've been sort of quote unquote canceled. A lot of times people will say things like, oh, Woody Allen or Louis C.K. or whoever, they've been punished enough, they've lost their reputation. But to me, there's a pretty substantial difference between reputational damage and actually serving time in a prison, which theoretically is supposed to be where you pay your debt to society. There's a lot of nuance in that conversation that this is not necessarily the right place to get into, but um, I sort of feel as though it's quite reasonable to look at to say I'm not interested in participating in art from someone who has not materially been punished for their alleged bad actions. And this is a person who actually has been punished really, really intensely and potentially horribly for their bad actions. And so I'm interested in experiencing their art and seeing whether it's possible for them to have some sort of redemptive achievement from it.
If I might piggyback on that a little bit, because I think that's exactly right. And one thing undercurrent, I think, especially with the Me Too movement, is that look, a lot of these guys got away with horrible things for a really long time, and the justice system failed, right? The institutions that should have kicked these guys out 30 years ago didn't do their job. So then we end up left as consumers being like, well, the only lever I have here is to like unselect you on my Spotify playlist. So I'm going to do that. And I think a lot of the anger from this and a lot of this is like, I don't have the right kind of tool here. And the tool that I have, which is some kind of nebulous consumer boycott, just doesn't fit the severity of the crime. That's not there in the Alaska case, right? These are situations where the person, as Constance says, is being punished. And that's a separate question about how that ought to go. But this is not a case where they've gotten away with it, right? And in not buying their artwork, I'm expressing displeasure for the fact that they haven't been appropriately punished. I'm doing something else, right? And the conversation's a little bit different. If I
Well,
purchase the artwork, I might be expressing my hope that they can be made better, right? Or
and
that
of course,
they can make amends.
there's always the possibility that some of them may have been wrongly convicted. This is a strange thing for the father of a criminal prosecutor to say. My son never wrongly convicts anybody, I'm sure. But um, as a part of the criminal justice process, I suppose that has to be taken into account as well. Before we head back over to Mike and see what some of our participants are communicating to him, I wanted to just sort of throw out a few names, also kind of lightning round to the four of you, um, who names that are, particularly controversial at the moment because I mean, one of you mentioned Woody Allen. That's been going on for quite some time, and Woody Allen movie fans have been had a real dilemma, and I think it's true that his pictures now get far less attention than they used to for his be they crimes or indiscretions or however one wants to classify them. But there are other names that come up: Roman Polanski, Kanye West, for example, who's I know some of my students like his music very much, but are very confused by the terrible, hateful things he has said recently, and then he's apologized for them. So then does he get some points back? And of course, how do we, the last question of all is, how do we establish any kind of standard, let alone an international standard that would, because you're a little bit further away, Estelle and Dennis, you may have some thoughts about this that would be helpful to us in the midst of all this.
I mean, the issues for me are that, these are individuals, they're celebrities. I think, that notion of celebrity is something that is both addictive in a contemporary world, online. People want to know the horrors of what people's lives are and kind of, feed on it. So there's a feeding frenzy that obviously someone like Kanye West can, utilize. He's very, very much now manipulating how he is perceived. He always has, perhaps, but that is part of his modus operandi, because that's how he built his brand, and that branding isn't one that I can get too morally kind of indignant about, because I know it's branding, and I think we all sort of know it, but it's very addictive, and we buy into it. So the notion of moral compass, and how we engage with artists or artworks and our moral compass is an interesting one that, we may all around this table feel that, certain politicians in America are very, have very, very questionable ethics, but still may potentially in polls be electable. So, there's a kind of curious sense whereby our indignation about individuals and what they do seems to me to be increasingly kind of a question which we're interested in the specifics, but not able to kind of debate or even respond to in the bigger picture, the more fundamental bigger picture.
Well, I actually think we're talking about artists and art somewhat, because we can't figure out what to do about the politicians and these parallel questions in politics are they're not harder, but they're a little more elusive, I would say. We can say this about art because we have choices about art and artistic expression, and arrogate to ourselves some decision power that we may lack elsewhere. Just my own interjection there. Dennis, I don't know if you wanted to add something.
No, just very briefly, Kanye West, I don't really know who he or she is. I vaguely know, but in terms of contemporary popular culture, I'm not the person to give you a very informed answer on it. But for me, it's very, very simple. From the little bit that I've seen of some music coming out of the States, I find it repugnant. And so I simply don't engage with it. So I'm perhaps not the person to be talking about. And I think that is one of the aspects in terms of artists producing music. I think Estelle was talking about branding. I have 4 daughters, and some of the music that I have been exposed to, I just find reprehensible. But it's not for me, and I don't listen to it. So I have the opportunity to simply not listen to it, and it's not for me. So I'm afraid I just don't engage with it. So I'm not in a good position to talk about that. And I sometimes think they want to. I saw one. I'd read so much about it. I saw a kind of flip side, I think, to a song, I think last year or the year before last, out of two female artists in America about exercising female sexuality, the power, and I found that equally repugnant. So it's not for me, and I'm kind of out of that question in terms of contemporary music that is questionable and contentious.
Right.
Apologies.
Well, we're presented with a lot of opportunities to express views sometimes on these matters. Mike is back, and let's see what he and John McCabe have taken in from the listeners and viewers that we should address now. Mike.
I want to start with moving on to just a slightly different area that's come up, given by John O'Keefe. And he says Cosby is a monster. But think of how many other writers, actors, producers, etc., will lose livelihood from loss of royalties by boycotting the show. What do we think about that? He asks another moral question. Who wants to take that?
I'll take that, actually, because I think that's actually a really good point. Possibly less with Cosby, right? Because most of his creative work at this point is well in the past. And the residuals from a 1980s show that hasn't been on syndication in some kind of time are probably pretty negligible. But I do think this is something to consider. And the way I've often gotten people into this question was due to a response when I was pitching the book from my editor, where I said, like, well, what about Good Will Hunting? And he's like, well, what did Matt Damon do? I'm like, Matt Damon didn't do anything, but it's a Harvey Weinstein production. And it hit me at that moment that a lot of the discourse focuses on the lead, right? The celebrity, the face of the thing. And a lot of the people who are doing the wrong things are behind the scenes. It's the producers, it's the director of the show. And that there are people whose, something like a movie isn't a solo artwork, right? You might harm the artist's box office potential, but the people who worked on the film or the second camera operator or the makeup artist are also affected by this. And it's I think not an insubstantial consideration, even though I'm not sure it applies in the Cosby case. I guess the lesson here for me is that attempting to cancel isn't really it's not a scalpel, it's a shotgun, right? What we're hoping to do with it, or at least I think what's often going on, is the idea is like, we're going to punish this person because they've escaped it in some other avenue. But really what you're doing is often just expressing you're not really affecting them and you might be affecting other people. And I think it makes it morally a little more murky.
If I could jump in as well to bounce off this a little bit, I think it's actually really productive for us to think about these auteurs, as we often think of them, as only one part of an enormous collaborative act when they're creating their movies. I think that for someone like Woody Allen, the fact that we think of him as an auteur and as a genius who is able to do things that are outside of the boundaries of conventional morality because of his genius, because of the movies, is perhaps part of what gives him the power to that he has allegedly abused so badly. And recognizing how much of what we love about the movies is like maybe Diane Keaton's performance in Annie Hall, is the thing of the movie. Or maybe it is like the light and the cinematography and things that don't necessarily come from Allen himself. I think that's a more holistic way of looking at the art and is also a way of potentially depowering these figures who have abused their powers really badly.
Any other comments, Estelle, on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I'm in agreement. I suppose I'm always curious about when there are collective artistic expressions that we always, it becomes one person's kind of film. I mean, he's, Weinstein's just, he's a producer. I mean, he's just, the man way behind the artistic expression. So the artistic expression that's going on is, a big team of people who all of whom collaborate to make something magical, or engaging, or fascinating. And so I think the cancel culture in that sense for me is, it's a very easy question. It's not about him, and to some extent, even the Me Too movement, it is that moment when, should we not always promote the name and the activity of the murderer, that we should look at the victims, or we should look at, so that there is a moment whereby that sort of, you don't have celebrity status through being an evil, despot, as much as, a celebrated individual. So, that's, I'm taking it to an extreme, but yeah, that's my take on it a little bit.
Thanks.
Which actually,
sorry, go on.
No, it's okay. It's okay. I was going to go back on two things, which is both the statues and artists or works being made in prisons. But I think we'll go with the questions. I won't go back.
Okay. Yeah. Let's. Sue Osler makes a statement here. She says, "I feel that artists are human and would still mostly be okay with the work of someone who is not moral. But I draw the line at a monster such as Hitler. I wouldn't even want to see what artwork he had created."
Well, the one thing I was going to talk about earlier on was, I don't know whether in the States you're aware of a TV program, Channel 4 TV program, which I actually never watched, which was called Jimmy Carr Destroys Art, I think. The premise of it was that essentially a small panel of people listened to two experts, both for and against the artwork, and it was decided by the end of the program whether it would be destroyed. And it was destroyed in different ways. I think there was one particular one where maybe it was a Picasso, was on, the weights above it with strings, and individuals could choose to cut it, and it would either fall and smash and ruin the artwork or not. But preceding it, there was a conversation that would be to look at the moral questions about either saving it or destroying it. So, that's another curious one where actually, of course, it became entertainment. The notion of real debate, perhaps, again, got slightly sidelined, and certainly a review. I didn't see the program, but the reviews that I read of it and the conversations I heard others talking about it, I think it became very, very quickly sort of, not it was entertainment, it was ultimately entertainment rather than a means to really dig down into the moral dilemmas of these questions.
I saw one of those, Estelle. I saw the one in which they had a piece of art done by Hitler. So let's go back to Sue Osler.
Apparently, it wasn't even necessarily a work by Hitler. It was disputed as to whether it was even
whether it was by Hitler or not. Yeah, absolutely. So there was a moral question there, but they voted and they cut it all up in the end, didn't they? Yeah. I actually, there's another issue here as well, because we have a certain morality and other people have a different morality. So I've been to China quite a lot with my work, and I was taken to a restaurant with beautiful paintings. And I asked about the paintings, and and they said, well, they're not just paintings, they're poems. They're poems and paintings that are interrelated, and they're by Chairman Mao. Okay. So there they are, beautiful, by Chairman Mao. Because I remember all the misery Chairman Mao caused. But they were very proud of Chairman Mao's paintings around. They were of a different culture. So that there's this kind of issue that comes then about whose culture is right or whose morality is right. And then you get the other issue about, well, what do you do about 18th century restoration comedy? Which comes about as a relief after a terrible civil war. And yet restoration comedy was written by some people who really were quite nasty people, and yet were making people laugh at least after everything that that had happened in the Civil War in England. So I mean, those kind of issues are bubbling around. Our morality. You talked about criminality. You know, Jesus Christ was a criminal. That's why he was executed. You know, the people who were in charge allowed that execution because he was seen as a criminal, saying that he was the son of God, or saying that he was the king, or
Well, the problem,
people saying that he was. Yeah.
The problem
So,
there, Mike, was that free expression was not very highly developed.
Precisely. Okay, but and maybe he was a free speech person, you know.
I think he must have been.
Yeah. I'm going to go on to another question from
Oh,
Ben.
I actually had
sorry,
something small to say to the questioner. If you don't want to look at Hitler's art, I'll say, like, you're not missing much, right? I mean, one of the things that's kind of interesting about it is that they're almost purely of just historical interest, you know. And I've shown this in the class that I'm actually teaching in about half an hour, where we talk about immoral art and immoral artists and how we react to it. And the students have, I think, a pretty interesting perspective on it, which is that they always feel like, oh, it's an art teacher trick. You show this picture of this pretty boring castle surrounded by some things, and you're like, ha, Hitler painted it. Now what do you think? And I'm like, it's still not a really interesting painting. And because of that, right, if you're really interested in the artwork, they're like, we kind of suspect that maybe there's something a little bit off about you, right? If you're really interested in this, in the way that you might give the side eye to somebody who's interested in the aesthetics of Nazi paraphernalia generally, right? I think so. I think the lesson, at least, I think that I'm drawing from a lot of this is that art is really inseparable from its context, right? And when you look at something like Hitler's paintings, yeah, it is relevant to maybe not evaluating the textures and the shading or the use of light or what have you, but why are we hanging on to this? Why are we talking about it? And why do we find it interesting? But yeah, to the general question, yeah, you're not missing much. So go look at a boring landscape painting in a hotel. You'll be 99% of the same aesthetic experience.
Can I just add to that, Beth, that I think it's also important to hang on to Hitler's paintings, the very few I've seen, to show that someone who is capable of watercolors and landscape paintings is also capable of the most horrendous crimes against humanity. And I think that's important. And I think destroying the painting has no bearing. It looks like you have agency, and you're just it removes any agency from the viewer. I think it's important to remember that pretty watercolors can also be part of the same person. And just to tie back to the discussion on the Anchorage, on the prisoners, it creates something, a forum for us to discuss and to help share ideas. How is it that a murderer can be rehabilitated? How is it that someone who's committed horrendous genocide can also paint watercolors? Sorry, Mike, sorry.
No, it's good. Carry on. Yeah.
The thing for me in this is, and I get terribly sort of elitist about it, that essentially for me, the prisoners in Alaska, it's very engaging therapy, and I wouldn't want to ever stop that being part of a possibility for those individuals. Same with Hitler. It's actually, we're not really talking about art. We're talking about the engage with something. So we're not really talking about how I want to define art, where it's something that really, moves society forward, moves us as human beings forward, challenges us, exalts us, makes us, think more or feel more intensely. And so these other aspects are, that then in a way, then it's interesting, but it doesn't matter too much, because for me, the dilemma becomes much more complex when I get to someone who I think probably was making great art. I don't know, Courbet's Origin of the World, you know, how do I feel about that? You know, the moment when this great artist decides to depict the sex of a woman with, those are moments that really do get me excited. The notion of prisoners displaying their art is, I think, some people like it, some people don't, and does it ultimately matter too much? It's a choice at that point for the individual to turn towards or away from engaging in it.
Thanks for that. Can I just go on to, I'll come back to you, Mary Beth.
All right.
Yeah, if I don't, remind me. But Ben Capps has an interesting question here. As a performer, composer, creator, and educator at Georgetown University, I struggle with separating my complicated life and my creative self from my public image in concert and in the academia. I often wonder if my personal life, portrayed in my art, can be detrimental to my career because of different views on what is acceptable. Could you speak to that concept and how I can try to reframe these fears to become more successful in both arenas, creative and public and academic? Wow, Ben, that's an interesting one. I might start by saying, not flippantly, but that's something to put in a book. If you're writing a book, that's a real kind of great book. But who wants to take that? Mary Beth.
I am not taking that one. No, it's only because I don't feel qualified to speak to what an artist ought to do. But I can say, I think generally, I mean, I think maybe I don't want to say, oh, you're just right to be concerned. That sounds flippant, but I do think that people, especially today, do expect to know about the artist in a way they didn't perhaps 40 years ago. Although I think this has had an interesting effect. So I've been discussing this with my students who, seem to me to be embryos. They're so young. But often when we talk about Me Too movement and artists, what's interesting that comes out in conversation is that they are less likely to get attached to an artist in the way that maybe somebody who grew up in the 80s and 90s did, where they're like, we just expect they're going to turn out to be bad people, so we're not getting attached. I'm like, oh, you're having a trauma response to all of art. But I think that there might be something to be said for that, to say, like, look, I like the artwork. I'm going to perhaps know about the artist and use what I know about them to evaluate it, but I'm going to stay a little bit away from hero worship. And so maybe, for an audience to cultivate that sense of distance, I think might actually be quite healthy. How that applies to the artist, I feel completely unqualified to speak about, but I will hand it off to our artists. Perhaps they have good things to say.
Estelle?
It was only that, Mary Beth, in you saying that, it completely made me think, not quite answering the question, but it made me think of many of my students instantly move everything that they make to Instagram and instantly want approval through that showing. And, it sometimes feels that the number of likes almost validates for them how they move forward. And that, without any time of reflection or evolution of something, sometimes our contemporary world, where, that notion of instantly, either not aligning yourself with something or very quickly knowing that, something can change, is a curious aspect for contemporary artists. I do think also they equally a little bit may be under pressure constantly to be as diverse and inclusive as they can. So there's in the Western world where everyone's online, there is a sense of agreeing, being politically correct, being conscious, not wanting to step outside of questions, responding in ways that are going to be approved, not cause any issues. So, I mean, it's not the same thing, but it runs in all of these conversations, I think, about how shifting trends about how you can both make as an artist or present as an artist or receive things as individuals.
Thanks for that. Justin Bow takes another line, which we've just got time, I think, to discuss. And Justine says, seems to me that tech giants are responsible for making some of these decisions for us, Netflix, Spotify, etc., either cancelling or uplifting certain artists. How do we think they should be involved in this discussion? Constance.
Yeah, I'd love to jump in here. And I think you're absolutely correct that Netflix and Spotify have much bigger platforms than any of us do and much more ability to affect someone with their decisions. We've seen this become a big tool for activists. When the news broke about the R. Kelly so-called sex cults before he was actually arrested, one of the first pieces of activist pressure to have results was the campaign to boycott R. Kelly. It got him taken off of Spotify. Um, and I think that in general, tech companies have been very reluctant to use these powers, except in cases where there are is striking legal ramifications already in place. We can see this in the way Twitter has responded to Trump. There was a lot of outcry for him to be taken off that platform for a very long time before they did eventually make the decision to do so. And they did so in part because there were legal ramifications to what he had done. So I think one question that it's reasonable for us to ask is whether it is responsible for these tech giants to be platforming people who have maybe allegedly done terrible things, or if it would be too punitive for them to keep playing, to sort of take away the choice from the individual consumer, whether or not they want to watch, say, The Cosby Show, which I believe has been taken off of most streaming platforms at this point because Bill Cosby was found guilty. It's a big, big question, and I think it is one of the most materially important of these questions in a way, because it is the one that will actually affect people's livelihoods in a way that our own individual choices are not likely to do so.
Thanks for that. Any other comments on that, Dennis? You're
Well,
muted,
one
Dennis.
thing I want as an overview, I think it's helpful in terms of trying to find a balance. We've talked a lot about the 21st century and 2024. A lot of the issues are very now. And I think it's helpful to look back 2,000 years and see what happened in 15th century Florence or Rome at the turn of the millennium to give us an idea of how cultures evolve and beliefs change. So I think an historical perspective is helpful when we look at these very particular day-to-day issues. That's
Fine.
it.
Okay. So I think we're going to have to leave it there. I'm going to hand back to Sandy. Do you want to make any further comments, Sandy?
Yes, just one thing I want to say, Mike, before my expressions of thanks is that I definitely do not trust the tech giants to help us solve these problems. Not at the moment, anyway. And I wish I did. I mean, I think there are some in Silicon Valley and other similar places who want to and are playing constructive roles, but I'm not satisfied that they are qualified to be the ultimate arbiters. Enough of that. This is a wonderful discussion. I have to say it takes my mind off some other things, problems of the moment that are less conducive to reasonable talk, it seems, at least in this country. So thank you all for contributing this extremely civilized and thoughtful conversation. I want to thank the people who help us put this monthly broadcast together, particularly John McCabe here at the Free Speech Project. And in this particular case, Ryan Finster and Logan Richmond, who offered ideas and pitched in when others were away, and helped us a great deal and made some great discoveries. So thank you for that, and thank you to Jack DeGioia and Joe Ferrara and Tom Banchoff and others in the hierarchy at Georgetown who encourage us, who encourage Mike Scott and me to do this work and to keep it going for through thick and thin, warm weather, bad weather, and perilous times. And it's a great pleasure, of course, to have Mike as a partner in that process.
Thanks for that, Sandy, and thank you as well. Thank you to Dennis, Constance, Mary Beth, Estelle. Terrific, great conversation, which will continue. Thanks, Sandy, for chairing the panel. The next Free Speech Project at the Crossroads International Dialogues event, in association with the Future of the Humanities Project, will be on Wednesday, May the 13th at 11 a.m. EST, 4 p.m. UK time, when we'll be moving this conversation on a little bit, but talking about censorship, the very notion of censorship, and looking forward to that. And I hope you'll all be joining us in one way or another there. I also want to mention another Zoom that we're doing on the Monday, the 29th of April, when Joseph Simmons, SJ, will be discussing Manzoni's The Betrothed in the series The Culture Encounters, Books That Have Made a Difference. And apparently Manzoni's book, The Betrothed, is the favorite book of Pope Francis, who's coined this term of cultural encounters. So looking forward very much to that on Monday, the 29th of April. My thanks, of course, to the people at Georgetown who have already been thanked, but also those at Blackfriars, John O'Connor, the Regent, and Richard Finn, the Director of the Las Casas Institute, and at Campion Hall to Nick Austin. And my personal thanks also to John McCabe. And congratulations, John, on your wedding last week. And we're delighted to see you back. So well done, John, and your partner. I would like to thank everyone who's asked, who's sending questions. I'm sorry, there was a question came in from Tess, but I thought that we had answered it before I was able to put it. So, but thanks, Tess, for putting in that question, and thanks the other people for putting in a question. Thank you all for your participation today. I'm Professor Michael Scott. I'm Fellow and Senior Dean at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. You can follow me on Facebook as Michael Kerr Scott or LinkedIn as Professor Michael Scott. Until next time, take care, keep safe. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.